May 12, 1945. Wiesbaden, Germany. The bombardment had ceased 3 days earlier, yet 19-year-old Ilse Hartmann continued to jump at unexpected noises. She stood among the debris of what had once been her father's drugstore, hunting for anything usable when she detected the vehicles. American vehicles. Her mother seized her arm forcefully enough to leave marks. "Remain behind me," she whispered urgently. "Don't make eye contact. Don't utter a word." Everything Ilse had been instructed said this encounter would be the most terrible of her existence. But when the military convoy halted and servicemen descended from the trucks, Ilse became paralyzed. They weren't what she'd been conditioned to anticipate. These American servicemen were black. The propaganda materials had depicted white Americans as thugs and lawbreakers. But black servicemen, the Nazi educational curriculum had instructed her they were scarcely human, inferior, threatening, primitive. Every term her instructors employed made them appear like beasts. The commanding soldier, a sergeant with compassionate eyes and corporal insignia, moved forward cautiously. He raised both hands, demonstrating they were empty. Then he spoke in imperfect German. "We bring food. Medical supplies. You require assistance." Ilse's complete worldview fractured in half because the voice that uttered those words was kind. And everything she'd been instructed said that was unthinkable. But before we explore further into this remarkable untold narrative that history attempted to hide, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment sharing where you're viewing from. The 761st Tank Battalion entered Western Germany like an apparition that shouldn't be real. The Black Panthers, they identified themselves, battle-tested warriors who'd campaigned through France with an intensity that won them a unit citation. Following them came the 92nd Infantry Division, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, and numerous other separated black units that America had deployed to combat but never fully recognized. 4 German non-combatants, particularly women who'd been conditioned to dread Americans. The initial meetings with black servicemen generated a mental contradiction so intense it destroyed decades of brainwashing in moments. Ilse Hartmann had invested her complete education absorbing racial classification. The Aryan race at the summit, other Europeans beneath, and at the absolute bottom, black individuals, subhuman, the educational materials stated, incapable of advancement, refinement, or intelligence. Her instructor, Frau Drescher, had been exceptionally forceful. "If you ever meet a Negro," she'd stated during a racial biology lesson in 1942, "remember they are controlled by primitive urges. They cannot restrain themselves. They are wild creatures in human shape." Ilse had trusted her. Why wouldn't she? Frau Drescher was an instructor, an expert, someone you believed. But now, positioned in the wreckage of Wiesbaden with her mother's nails piercing into her arm, Ilse observed the sergeant methodically place down a box of C rations. He withdrew immediately, allowing them distance. Another serviceman, younger, perhaps 20, positioned a container of potable water next to it. Then they pulled back to their trucks and remained still. "It's deception," Ilse's mother murmured. "They're evaluating us, determining if we're hungry enough." But Ilse's younger brother, merely 7 years old and gaunt-faced from starvation, escaped and sprinted to the box. The servicemen didn't react, didn't yell. The sergeant simply acknowledged and indicated the food, gesturing an eating motion. That evening, Ilse sat in their basement consuming canned meat and biscuits while her mother sobbed. "I don't comprehend," her mother repeated. "I don't comprehend." Neither did I. But the mental contradiction had only barely started. In the settlement of Babenhausen, 28-year-old Margaret Schiller experienced a separate first meeting. She'd been concealing in a rural house with 5 other women, all of them frightened when a squadron from the 761st Tank Battalion located them. The instant they detected footsteps on the staircase, the women clustered together, whispering prayers. They'd received accounts from refugees escaping the Eastern Front. Soviet servicemen, they reported, demonstrated no compassion. Margaret presumed Americans would be identical. When the entrance opened and Margaret witnessed the soldiers' features, her initial reaction was that she was imagining from malnutrition, black complexion, American uniform. The paradox made no logic in her belief system. In Nazi Germany, black individuals didn't exist as actual entities. They were abstract monsters, pictures in propaganda, cautions about the hazards of racial integration in American civilization. The serviceman, Corporal James Thompson from Detroit, noticed the panic in their expressions and quickly retreated from the space. He summoned down to his lieutenant and within moments, a German-fluent translator appeared. The translator, a Jewish escapee who'd fled to America in 1938, stood in the entrance and announced, "You are not captives. You are non-combatants." We must verify that you're not injured. Then we'll depart you undisturbed. Margaret studied Thompson's features during this conversation. He appeared uneasy, almost ashamed, like he understood precisely what they'd been instructed to believe about him. Subsequently, she would recall that look and experience a guilt so profound it became tangible. The 92nd Infantry Division, a completely black unit excluding white commanders, formed occupation territories throughout southern Germany. 4 women in settlements like Mannheim, Ludwigshafen, and Kaiserslautern. This signified their first prolonged interaction with black Americans. In Mannheim, 31-year-old Gisela Werner served as a translator for the occupation command. She'd studied English before the conflict, and despite her anxiety, she required the employment desperately. Her initial day, she was designated to assist coordinate food allocation. The commander in authority was Lieutenant Marcus Washington, an attorney from Chicago. Gisela couldn't cease observing, not from interest, but from attempting to harmonize reality with everything she'd absorbed. Washington was educated, eloquent, competent. He discussed international jurisprudence and humanitarian duties. He recited the Geneva Convention from recollection. Every moment she invested in his company demolished another fragment of her brainwashing. During an interval, Washington detected her unease. "Ma'am," he stated quietly in measured German, "I understand what you were instructed about individuals who resemble me. I'm not going to act, it doesn't signify, but I require you to translate precisely, and I require you to handle the individuals we're assisting with respect. Can you accomplish that?" Gisela nodded, incapable of speaking. Subsequently that evening she recorded in her journal, "Everything was deception. Everything. How many additional deceptions was I told?" The mental contradiction functioned on several dimensions. First, there was the astonishment of meeting black servicemen whatsoever. Most German women had never witnessed a black individual in their existences. The Reich had fewer than 20,000 black inhabitants before the conflict, predominantly in metropolitan areas, and most had been oppressed or eliminated. Second, there was the conduct of the servicemen themselves. They weren't primitive. They weren't unrestrained. They observed regulations, displayed discipline, exhibited education and capability. One woman from Stuttgart, Anna Koch, described in a 1946 interview, "I anticipated creatures. I discovered men who were more refined than our own servicemen had been." The third dimension was the compassion. Despite understanding what German women had been instructed, despite comprehending the depths of racist brainwashing they'd experienced, many black servicemen responded with kindness that appeared incomprehensible. In the settlement of Pforzheim, extensively demolished by Allied bombardment, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion established medical assistance stations. Medic Samuel Johnson from Alabama discovered himself treating German non-combatants who recoiled when he came near. He operated carefully, clarifying each procedure, allowing them space to withdraw if they required. One aged woman, Frau Holtzmann, spat on him during care. Johnson cleaned the injury on her leg regardless, wrapped it correctly, and provided her antibiotics from his restricted supply. He mentioned nothing about the occurrence. The following day, Frau Holtzmann returned with her granddaughter. She apologized in broken English. Johnson acknowledged with a simple gesture. Years subsequently, the granddaughter Lotte Holtzmann would state, "My grandmother wept for 3 days following that. She stated she'd invested her complete life trusting deceptions, and now she would invest the remainder of her life attempting to atone." The marriages commenced within months. Despite fraternization regulations, despite military restrictions, despite the disgust of both American military authorities and German populations, relationships developed. In Bavaria alone, documentation shows over 150 marriages between black American soldiers and German women by late 1946. These weren't simple attractions. Each relationship symbolized a complete rejection of Nazi racial philosophy. For the women, deciding to marry a black soldier signified accepting that everything they'd been instructed was not merely incorrect, but catastrophically morally incorrect. Ilse Hartmann, the pharmacist's daughter from Wiesbaden, married Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell of the 761st Tank Battalion in 1947. Her mother rejected her. Her previous neighbors labeled her a betrayer, but Ilse stated in a correspondence to her sister, "I would prefer being a betrayer to deceptions than remaining faithful to the wickedness I was instructed." The offspring of these marriages, the occupation children, confronted severe discrimination in Germany. Many were ultimately adopted by their fathers' relatives in America. But their presence demonstrated something the Nazi government had invested enormous effort refuting: that humanity surpasses the false categories racism establishes. The psychological effect on German women who met black servicemen with preconceived ideas from Nazi propaganda frequently followed a sequence. First came astonishment at the gap between expectation and actuality. Then came guilt as they acknowledged their brainwashing. Finally came a wider questioning of everything they'd been instructed. Margaret Schiller, who'd concealed in the rural house, became a vocal anti-racism campaigner in post-war Germany. She presented at educational institutions about her experience, beginning every presentation the same method. I was instructed to despise. I was instructed to dread. And then I encountered actual human beings. And everything I'd been instructed revealed itself as deception designed to create monsters of us all. Not every meeting was favorable. Some black servicemen, embittered by separation in their own military and racism in their own nation, displayed little tolerance for German non-combatants. Some German women, too devoted to their brainwashing, declined to acknowledge actuality even when it stood before them. But the majority of meetings followed the sequence Ilse Hartmann experienced: expectation of brutality, followed by the gradual, uncomfortable awareness that the brutality existed not in the servicemen they'd been instructed to dread, but in the apparatus that instructed them to dread. The contradiction wasn't overlooked by many black servicemen. They'd been battling to defeat a racist government while serving in a separated military from a nation that still implemented Jim Crow. Lieutenant Washington informed Gisela Werner during one of their working sessions, "We're here to defeat your racism while being compelled to exist with our own. It's ridiculous. Someday both our nations will have to confront what they've accomplished." By 1948, as occupation responsibilities concluded and black units returned home, they left behind transformed populations. The women who'd cooperated with them, married them, or simply met them, carried forward a truth: that the racial classifications they'd been instructed were fabrications, deceptions designed to dominate and dehumanize. Ilse Mitchell, previously Hartmann, corresponded to her sister in 1963 after viewing news reports of the March on Washington. "When I witnessed Dr. King present, I reflect about Robert and the other men from his unit. They battled a racist empire internationally, then returned home to battle racism in their own nation. They instructed me that bravery means challenging the deceptions you were raised to trust. That's the instruction I'll carry until I perish." German offspring born after the conflict absorbed a separate history than their parents. The mental contradiction their mothers experienced became educational moments. When Lotte Holtzmann had offspring of her own, she informed them about the black medic who cared for her grandmother with compassion despite being spat upon. "Your great-grandmother absorbed the most difficult instruction," Lotte would state, "that the individuals you're instructed to despise are often more human than the individuals who instruct you to despise." The occupation records contain thousands of minor moments like these: medical care provided to hostile non-combatants, food distributed despite resentment, professional courtesy offered even when met with racist contempt. Each moment was a hammer strike against the philosophy of supremacy. The enduring effect wasn't calculated in military triumphs or territory dominated. It was calculated in the women who decided to question everything they'd been instructed, in the offspring who matured hearing their mothers declare, "I was incorrect. We were all incorrect," in the gradual, painful procedure of acknowledging that humanity cannot be separated into classifications of value. For the black servicemen themselves, the experience was complicated. They'd been handled with more dignity by former enemy non-combatants than by their own military. They'd demonstrated their value in battle, only to return home to a nation that still refused them fundamental rights. The paradox was harsh, but for the German women who met them, the servicemen symbolized an undeniable truth: that the Nazi government had constructed itself on deceptions so fundamental, so comprehensive that acknowledging one deception meant questioning everything. Ilse Mitchell's final correspondence to her sister, composed in 1975, captured the transformation. "I was 19 years old when I encountered Robert. I'd been instructed my complete life that he was subhuman. Within 1 week of understanding him, I realized I was the one who'd been made less than human by trusting such things. The educational apparatus, the propaganda, the instructors, they didn't merely instruct us to despise others. They instructed us to demolish our own capability for acknowledging humanity. That's what I'll never pardon." The narrative of German women meeting black American servicemen for the first time is ultimately a narrative about the weakness of brainwashing when challenged with actuality. It's about the astonishment of acknowledgement when propaganda meets actual human beings. And it's about the bravery required to confess you were incorrect about something so fundamental it shaped your complete worldview. These women transported that instruction forward. They raised offspring who questioned power. They presented at educational institutions about the dangers of trusting what you're instructed without examining it. They became living demonstration that transformation is achievable, that acknowledgement of one's own brainwashing is the initial step towards something superior. History calculates wars and battles, casualties and territorial modifications. But for these women, history was calculated in the instant their certainty destroyed. In the second they realized that the monsters they'd been cautioned about were more human than the apparatus that cautioned them. That awareness transformed everything. Not instantly, not simply, but thoroughly. And in the wreckage of defeated Germany, among women who'd been instructed to dread and despise, the simple gesture of handling others with respect became the most revolutionary gesture of all.